The job posting said Biological Threat Escort. Rael Doran had seen enough polite words for dangerous work to know what that meant. It meant nobody else wanted to go. He and Oren Fass were the only two humans on the Coalition vessel Seraph. The ship was clean, fast, and smelled faintly of something sweet that Rael could never identify. The crew were Vathi, tall, thin, with smooth gray shells and forearms that moved in ways that still felt wrong to human eyes, even after weeks aboard. They did not hate the humans. That would have required acknowledging them. Oren had tried in the first week. He had smiled at the crew, learned 3 words of their language, and offered to share his food once. The Vathi had looked at the offering the way someone looks at a wet sock left on a chair. After that, Oren mostly kept to their shared bunk room and talked to Rael, who listened without saying much. Rael was used to being the unwanted one. He had spent 6 years as a medic in the Davan conflict zones, the ugliest patches of contested space where human factions and 2 alien governments had spent a decade grinding each other down over mining rights. He had worked in the dirt, in the blood, in the places where the people giving orders never went. He had carried more bodies than he could count and saved fewer than he wanted to remember. When the wars ended, the skills remained. There was always somewhere that needed a man who could stay calm in a room where everything was going wrong. Ambassador Saya found him before the mission briefing. She was the senior Vathi envoy aboard. Her shell had a pale gold tint that Rael had been told marked high status, though he could not tell if that was true or something Oren had made up. She looked at him the way she looked at the ship's emergency equipment. Present, functional, and hopefully unnecessary. "You are the escort unit," she said. "Not a question." "Yes," Rael said. "Your role is containment support. You will follow Coalition tactical guidance at all times. You will not make independent decisions in the field." "Understood," Rael said. She waited, as if expecting him to argue. He did not. The briefing came an hour later in the ship's forward room. A research outpost called Davan, 7 on the moon Sorath, had gone silent 18 hours ago. The last transmission was fragmented, broken equipment sounds, shouting in 2 languages, and then a long scraping noise that the Coalition's acoustic analysts had already identified. They had heard it before, 60 years ago. It was the sound a Grath made when it moved across metal. The Grath were old. Not ancient in the way stars were ancient, but old in the way that bad ideas were old. They had been made by someone who no longer existed for a war that no longer mattered, and they had outlasted both. They were large, armored, and built without anything resembling mercy in their design. One adult Grath had destroyed a mid-sized colony ship in 11 minutes during the last confirmed sighting. The Coalition had classified them as Class 9 biological threats and issued standing extermination orders decades ago. The believed population, near 0. Most had been hunted down in the years after the war that made them .1, apparently, had not. Rael asked 3 questions during the briefing. How many survivors were estimated at the outpost? 8 to 12, based on registered crew. How long had the Grath been on site before the transmission cut? Unknown, at least 6 hours. What was the outpost structural layout? Saya answered the first 2. For the third, she pulled up a diagram without looking at him, the way someone tosses a tool without checking who catches it. Oren leaned close to Rael after the briefing ended. 60 years dormant, he whispered. They thought it was gone. Things that are built to survive usually do. Rael said. They dropped out of warp 4 hours later. Sorath appeared in the view screen, gray-brown, pocked with craters, ringed by a thin haze of atmospheric dust. It looked like a place that had never been comfortable and had stopped trying. The outpost was visible from orbit. Or rather, what was left of it was visible. 3 of the 4 main structures had collapsed inward. The landing bay was partially intact. Thermal scans showed 8 heat signatures clustered deep in the lowest level, alive, not moving, likely barricaded, and 1 much larger heat signature, slow and steady, moving in a wide circle around the outpost perimeter. IT was not leaving. It was not attacking. It was circling. Rael studied the scan for a long time. Saya caught him looking and said nothing. She was already organizing the landing team. 4 Vathi soldiers in full armor, plus Rael, Oren, and the ship's junior medic, a young Vothi named Lyrian who had spoken to Rael exactly twice and seemed more curious than hostile as the shuttle prepared to descend. Oren strapped into his seat and stared at the view screen. The large heat signature made another slow loop. Why is it still there? Oren asked quietly. Rael buckled his harness and kept watching the scan. That's the right question, he said. The shuttle dropped towards Sorith, and the gray moon rose up to meet them. The shuttle landed hard on a cracked section of the outpost's exterior platform, and the dust of Sorith rose up around it like something disturbed from a long sleep. Rael stepped out first. Not because he was ordered to, because he wanted to see before the others started reacting. The outpost had been torn apart slowly, not all at once. The outer walls were scored with deep parallel lines, the kind left by something enormous dragging itself along a surface. Supports had been pushed inward, not blasted. Structural panels lay bent and peeled back like foil. Whatever had done this had not been in a hurry. The 4 Vothi soldiers fanned out behind him, weapons raised, moving in tight clusters the way they had been trained. Oren stayed close to Rael. Lyrian, the young medic, carried her kit and moved carefully, her 4 eyes scanning everything without settling on one thing for long. The large heat signature was not visible yet, but it was close. The scan on Rael's wrist unit showed it on the far side of the outpost, still moving in that same wide, patient circle. They found the survivors in the lower storage bay, exactly where the thermal scan had shown them. A reinforced door, barricaded from inside with equipment crates and what looked like a deconstructed wall panel. Rael knocked twice, not loudly. Something about the silence of the outpost made him instinctively quiet that a voice came through the door. Shaking. Who's there? Coalition escort team. 8 of us. We're getting you out. A pause. Then the sound of things being moved. The door opened on a room full of frightened people. 8 researchers, 3 Vothi for humans, 1 species Rael didn't recognize. All of them pressed against the far wall, all of them looking past Rael to the door behind him, as if something might follow him in. It's still out there, one of the humans said. A woman, older, with a cut above her eye that had stopped bleeding hours ago. It's been circling. It won't leave. We know, Rael said. How long since it last came close to this section? For hours, maybe 5. It came once and just looked at the door, then left. Rael filed that. Something that could tear through reinforced wall panels had stood in front of a sealed door and not broken it down. He said nothing about this to the room. Getting the survivors out should have been straightforward. Move through the outpost's intact lower corridor. Reach the shuttle, depart. 12 minutes, maybe 15, that they were 6 minutes in when Oren stopped walking, that he was near a collapsed section of the corridor where the ceiling had come down at an angle, creating a low dark pocket between the debris and the floor. He had his light on it. His voice was quiet. Rael. Rael came back. He crouched and looked. In the gap, half buried under a fallen beam, was a juvenile Grath that was maybe a third the size of what an adult would be, which still made it roughly the size of a large ground vehicle. Its armor plating was the same dark gray-brown as the ruins around it, which was probably why no one had seen it on the thermal scan. The debris above it had masked the signature. One of its forelimbs was pinned under the beam. It was breathing. Barely. Rael did not move for a long moment. He looked at the juvenile. Then he looked at his wrist scanner. The adult's heat signature had stopped circling. It was on this side of the outpost now. The Vothi soldiers reacted the way trained soldiers react to a threat-adjacent discovery. They raised weapons, 2 of them stepping back, one of them reaching for his comm to report up the line. One of the researchers made a sharp sound of alarm. Oren pressed against the wall. Then the adult Grath came around the corner of the corridor. The IT filled the space completely. The walls to either side of it were close enough that its armor scraped them as it moved. Its one good eye, the other was a pale, milky scar, fixed on the group. It stopped. Nobody fired. Whether that was training or pure fear, Rael couldn't tell. He could feel the soldiers behind him starting to build toward a reaction. The kind of reaction that would end everything quickly and badly. One of them was already adjusting his footing. Rael stepped forward. Not fast. Not dramatic. He just stepped out of the group and stood between the Grath and the rest of them, and he stopped moving. The Grath's eye moved to him. The IT was enormous up close. Its breath came out in slow waves that Rail could feel against his skin. Its undamaged forelimbs were planted on the floor, each one the width of a door. It smelled like hot metal and something deep and animal underneath. IT looked at him. He looked back. Behind him, he heard Seiya's voice through the comms, sharp and precise. Escort unit. Fall back. Now. Rail did not move. He held his hands slightly out from his body, not raised in surrender, just visible. Open. Not holding anything. The Grath did not charge. IT breathed. He breathed. And for the first time since they had landed on Soreth, nothing got worse. There is a moment in a standoff when the situation decides which way it will fall. Rail had lived through enough of them to feel it, a kind of pressure in the air, like the instant before a storm breaks. Everything balanced, everything waiting. The Grath had not moved. Its single pale eye was fixed on Rail, and it was reading him the same way he was reading it. Rail had worked in conflict zones where neither side spoke the same language, where radio silence meant you could not call for help and body language was the only thing standing between a conversation and a catastrophe. He had learned early that most living things, human, alien, or otherwise, were very good at reading intent. Not words, not uniforms, not rank, intent. That he kept his hands visible. He kept his breathing steady. He did not look away from the Grath, but he made sure his face was not doing the thing faces did when they were afraid and angry at the same time. He just looked at it, present, still. Then, slowly, he pointed, first at the juvenile trapped under the beam in the collapsed section behind him, then at the Grath, then back at the juvenile. The Grath head shifted, just slightly. Its breathing changed, still slow but different, something in the rhythm of it. Rail turned away from the Grath. This was the part that took everything he had, because every trained instinct in his body told him not to turn his back on a Class 9 threat that was close enough to reach him in one step. He turned anyway, because turning away was the only thing that would mean what he needed it to mean. He walked toward the collapsed section. He got down on one knee beside the beam that pinned the juvenile's forelimb. He put his hands on it. The beam was heavy. Rail was not a large man. He got his shoulder under one end and pushed, and it moved about 4 centimeters, and the juvenile made a sound, low, almost below hearing, more of a vibration than a noise. He heard footsteps behind him. Small ones. Lyrian crouched beside him without a word. She was a medic. She understood immediately what he was doing and what it meant. She got her hands under the other end of the beam. Together they pushed. The beam shifted, groaned, and came free. The juvenile's limb pulled loose. It lay still for a moment, then tried to move and couldn't. The limb was damaged, maybe broken. Rail opened his field kit. He heard one of the Vothi soldiers hiss something behind him. He heard Seiya's voice again through the comms, quieter this time. What is the escort unit doing? Not a question. More like something said to a room when you cannot believe what you are seeing. Rail did not answer. He worked. The juvenile's plating was different from an adult's, softer at the joints, where growth was still happening. The damaged limb had a fracture he could feel but not see. He could not fix that. But the secondary damage, torn tissue at the joint, exposed and starting to swell, that he could address. He cleaned it. He packed it. He bound it the way he had bound injuries on creatures he had never seen before in field conditions with no reference material, because sometimes that was the job. The juvenile did not try to bite him. It watched him with both eyes. Its eyes were not injured, and it breathed in that same low vibration while he worked. The adult Grath had not moved from the corridor entrance. When Rail finished and sat back on his heels, the juvenile shifted its weight carefully and made a slow attempt to lift itself. It managed to get upright on 3 limbs. The fourth it held tucked close. IT stood there. It looked at Rail. Then it turned its head and looked at its parent. Rail stood up. He stepped back, giving the juvenile room. He was watching the adult the whole time, because that was the real conversation happening here. Not between him and the juvenile, but between him and the thing that could end all of them if it decided to. The Grath lowered its head. Not a lot. Just enough. The way something very large makes itself slightly smaller when it no longer needs to be as large as possible. The juvenile moved toward it, slow and lopsided on 3 limbs. When it reached the adult, It pressed itself against its parent side and stayed there. The graph curved one massive forelimb around it, not tight, just present. A shelter made of armor and size. The sound the graph made then was one that no one in the corridor had ever heard before. The researchers who had cataloged graph behavior over decades had recordings of aggression, warning calls, territorial sounds. They did not have a recording of this. It was low. It was long. It was not threatening. Lyrian stood beside Rael and said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, in her own language, she said something that Rael did not understand. But her tone he understood fine. He picked up his kit and looked back at the group behind them. The soldiers, the researchers, Oren, who was staring with his mouth slightly open. Nobody spoke. Rael looked at the graph, and the graph looked at him, and the juvenile breathed slowly against its parent's side. The situation had decided which way to fall. The survivors were aboard the shuttle within 20 minutes. Nobody had been hurt. The graph had not followed. It had watched the group move toward the landing platform and had not come after them. It had turned back, slowly, toward the deeper sections of the outpost where it could be with its juvenile in the dark. Rael was the last one onto the shuttle. He stood on the platform for a moment before boarding, looking back at the entrance where the graph had been. Nothing there now, just the ruined corridor and the gray light of Sortha's sky that he got on the shuttle. The trip back to the Sarath was quiet. The researchers were exhausted and shaken. The Vathi soldiers did not speak. Oren sat with his hands on his knees and stared at the floor. Lyrian was working, documenting the survivor injuries, noting vitals, doing her job with the careful focus of someone who deals with what is in front of her rather than what just happened. Rael sat and thought. Not about what he had done. He was clear on that. He thought about what would happen next. He was still thinking about it when Saya pulled him aside in the Saratha's secondary corridor, before the survivors had even been settled into the medical bay. You ignored a direct instruction in the field, she said. I did, Rael said. That is a contract violation. It may result in termination of your engagement. I understand. She looked at him with the expression that he had learned over weeks was her version of trying to understand something that did not fit into her existing framework. The creature could have killed you. It could have killed all of us much earlier and didn't, Rael said. That seemed worth paying attention to. She had no response for that immediately. She left point 40 minutes later. Council Speaker Duval appeared on the Saratha's main comm screen. Rael was not invited to that conversation, but the ship was not large and sound traveled. He heard it from the corridor outside the bridge, and he did not walk away. Duval's voice was the kind of calm that institutions produce. Not peace, just the absence of visible emotion. He spoke the way documents were written, precise, already decided. The Grath was a Class 9 designated threat. Standing extermination orders had been in place for 63 years. The confirmed presence of an active adult on an inhabited moon constituted an automatic trigger for those orders. The orbital weapons array on the Sarath was authorized and equipped for surface elimination. This was not a discussion. This was a notification. Ambassador Saya acknowledged the order. Duval added that a compliant confirmation was required within 2 hours and ended the transmission. Rael walked away from the corridor. He found Oren in the bunk room, sitting on his bed, and told him what he had heard. Oren listened with his hands folded and his face doing the thing it did when he was working something out. They're going to fire on the surface, Oren said. Yes. The creature didn't hurt anyone. It stayed with its young. Yes. Oren was quiet for a moment. Does Saya know what she's authorizing? She knows exactly what she's authorizing, Rael said. She's not confused about it. Then what do we do? Rael did not answer that yet. He went to find Lyrian instead. That he found her in the medical bay, finished with the survivors, writing up her documentation. She looked up when he came in. She had the careful expression of someone who had been thinking hard since the shuttle and had not stopped. The juvenile will need the binding changed in 36 hours, she said. If it survives, it'll survive, Rael said. Unless the strike happens. She set down her stylus. I heard. I'm going back down, Rael said. Say is giving me the surface confirmation. It's a formality before the strike. I have maybe 20 minutes on the ground. You will not change the order from the surface. No, he said. but I have something I need to do before it happens. Lyrian looked at him for a long time. Then she stood and picked up her kit. I am a coalition medical officer, she said. Sorith is still technically an active research site. I have documented reason to return to the surface for post-incident biological assessment. Rael looked at her. You do not need to ask me, she said simply. I'm telling you. They told Seiya they were going down for surface confirmation. Seiya authorized it with the flat efficiency of someone moving through a checklist. She told them they had until the 2-hour window was up. She did not tell them to hurry. Rael noticed that. He filed it, the way he filed everything, quietly, without reaction. The shuttle descended towards Sorith a second time. The gray-brown surface came up through the viewport, the ruined outpost a dark shape in the dust. Somewhere below the surface debris and the torn metal and the silence, something large was breathing slowly in the dark with its injured young beside IT. IT had not run. It had nowhere to go, and it had not run. Rael opened a comm channel to the Seraph. Kept it open. Said nothing yet. He was saving that for when he was standing in front of it. They found a graph in the deepest intact section of the outpost, in a wide storage chamber where the ceiling had held and the walls still stood. The juvenile was lying flat, its bound limb extended, breathing steadily. The adult was beside it, its enormous body curved around the smaller one like a wall. When Rael's light swept the room, the graph's head came up. Its single working, I found him immediately. IT did not rise. It watched. Rael walked forward until he was close enough that stopping felt like a choice, not a distance. Lyrian stayed a few steps behind him. The comm on his wrist was still open. He could hear the faint ambient hiss of the channel, the quiet sounds of the Seratha's bridge in the background. He looked at the graph for a long moment. The adult looked back at him. The juvenile shifted slightly in its sleep, but did not wake. Rael turned his head toward the comm. Everyone on the Seraph could hear what he said next. He knew that. He had left the channel open specifically for this. I'm looking at it right now, he said. Give me a reason, or give me a minute. The bridge was quiet. Then he looked back at the graph and said, clearly, to the open channel, should I spare it, or end it? Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything at all for several seconds. That silence was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just been handed a question they had not expected to be asked, and who suddenly found that answering it was harder than it should have been. Rael waited. He was good at waiting. Lyrian spoke first. Her voice was quiet, precise, and carried the weight of someone choosing their words because they mattered. It did not harm us when it could have. That is documented. I was present. On the bridge, one of the Vathi soldiers, the one who had been closest during the standoff in the corridor, stepped back from the weapons console. He did not speak. He just moved away from it, as if creating distance from the thing he was being asked to do. Then, Council Speaker Duval's voice came through the channel, cold and certain. This conversation is not authorized. The order stands. Ambassador Seiya, initiate the strike sequence. A pause. Seiya's voice, stand by. Duval, Ambassador. The order, I said stand by. Rael did not look at his comm. He kept his eyes on the graph. He began to speak, not loudly, not with the rhythm of someone making a speech. He spoke the way he had spoken in briefings after bad missions, when the people listening needed facts, not comfort. The creature has been present on this moon for an unknown period, he said. In that time, it destroyed unoccupied structures and pinned 8 researchers in a storage bay. It did not break through a sealed door. It could have broken through in under a minute. It did not pursue or attack a 12-person ground team moving through its territory. When its juvenile was injured, it stood in a corridor with armed soldiers and waited. It allowed 2 people to approach and treat its young without any attempt to prevent or respond with force. He let that sit for a moment. These are not the behaviors of an indiscriminate weapon. These are the behaviors of something that made a calculation and chose restraint every time it could have chosen otherwise. Duval again, harder this time. You are a hired escort. You do not have authority over coalition. I know, Rael said. I'm not claiming authority. I'm providing a field observation, which is what I was hired to do. He paused. The standing order was written 60 years ago about a weapon. What's in this room is not a weapon right now. It's a parent. Silence. Then Rails said the thing he had been thinking since the shuttle ride down. The thing he had held until the right moment. If you fire on this moon while I'm standing here, in front of a creature that showed restraint, you send a message to every species watching. You tell them that showing mercy to coalition personnel gets you killed. That holding back when you could have attacked is a death sentence. He kept his voice level. You will not be striking a threat. You will be teaching every living thing in this sector that mercy is a mistake. The bridge was very quiet. Duval started to speak. Then stopped. The Grath had not moved through any of this. It sat with its juvenile, and it breathed, and it watched Rail with its one good eye, and whatever understanding existed between them in that chamber, whatever had been built in the corridor, and the rubble, and the field kit, and the open hands, it held. The comm crackled. Oren's voice came through from somewhere on the ship. He was not on the bridge. Rail, Oren said. I need about 10 minutes. I'm working on something. Take your time, Rail said. He sat down on the floor of the chamber, cross-legged in the dust and debris, in front of a creature that could end him in a single motion. The Grath watched him sit. After a moment, it lowered its head back down beside its juvenile, and the two of them waited together for the world outside to make up its mind. Oren Fass was not a soldier. He was not a tactician. He was a ship technician who had grown up fixing things that other people broke, and he was very, very good at understanding how systems worked. The Seraphi's orbital weapons array was an elegant piece of equipment. Precision calibrated, fast to arm, reliable. It was also connected to every other system on the ship through a shared power routing network, because the designers had valued efficiency. Oren had spent the last 3 weeks aboard the ship fixing a persistent calibration error in the port sensor array. To do that, he had needed access to the routing network. He knew it the way he knew the inside of his own bunk. Every line, every junction, every place where a small adjustment created a ripple somewhere else, he did not sabotage the weapons array. He would say this clearly afterward, and it was technically true. He introduced a recalibration loop into the targeting system, the kind of targeting system needed periodically anyway, that required a manual override to clear. The loop was legitimate maintenance. The timing was that IT bought 11 minutes. While those 11 minutes ran, Rail spoke. And while Rail spoke, his open comm channel, which he had never closed, which was transmitting to the Seraph, which was in turn in standard relay contact with the wider coalition network as required during active missions, was being received by everyone on that network. 17 research vessels. 2 coalition news relay stations. The automated monitoring archives of 3 science academies. By the time Duval's authorization reached Seya's console, and Seya moved to input the strike command, the footage and audio from Soreth had been received by enough eyes and ears that the next 30 minutes were no longer a closed conversation between a council speaker and a ship. Seya looked at the authorization code on her screen. She looked at it for a long time. Then she entered. Request pending biological assessment completion. Regulatory hold. Reference. Mediclarian Field Report. Active documentation. Article 14 of Coalition Research Site Protocols. .it was a real article. It was a real hold. It required nothing dishonest. It simply required someone to invoke it. Council Speaker Duval's channel went quiet. Then, after a pause that stretched long enough that the bridge crew stopped pretending to look at other screens. This is not over, Ambassador. No, Seya said. I expect it is not. On the surface of Soreth, Rail felt his comm vibrate. He looked at it. A short message from Oren. Done what I can. However this goes, it was the right call. Rail put the comm away and looked at the Grath. You can go, he said aloud, knowing the creature could not understand his words. There's a way out through the east section. The wall is already down. Go deep. Go somewhere they can't see you. He did not know if any of that landed. He did not know if the Grath had a concept of leaving that did not involve being driven out. He did know that the creature had been surviving, alone, for 60 years. It understood something about not being found. The Grath rose. Slowly, it stood and it looked at Rail, and then it turned and it looked at the passage leading to the outpost's eastern section. The collapsed wall, the open gray sky of Soreth beyond. IT looked back at him once. Then it moved. Quietly, for something its size. The juvenile followed on its 3 good limbs, lopsided but steady, and the 2 of them disappeared into the debris and the dust and the pale light of the moon. Rael and Lyrian stood in the empty chamber for a moment. "Your contract is terminated," Lyrian said. "Yes. Orin's as well." "Probably." She picked up her kit. "I am submitting a full biological incident report to the Coalition Science Board. It will be thorough. It will reference every detail of what was observed." She paused. "I am also resigning my post and requesting a transfer to Human Coalition Liaison Research." Rael looked at her. "Somebody should study what happened here properly," she said. "And I find that I am more curious about humans than I expected to be." They took the shuttle back up. The formal reprimand for Rael and Orin was filed within the hour. Contract terminated. Fee reduction. Notation of field insubordination. Duval pushed for criminal obstruction charges against Orin, but the recalibration loop was legitimate maintenance, and 3 coalition legal officers reviewing the case could not make obstruction stick to a scheduled procedure. Say's official incident report was filed 2 days later. It was 8 pages of precise, careful documentation. The final line read, "The escort unit's intervention was unauthorized and insubordinate." It was also correct. She never said this to Rael directly. He read it later, on a transport back to human space, when someone forwarded him the public record. Orin fell asleep 2 hours into the journey. Rael sat by the viewport and watched the stars. Was it worth it? Orin had asked, before he drifted off. Rael had not answered, yet he thought about a creature alone on a gray moon for 60 years, choosing to circle rather than kill when frightened people stumbled into its territory. A juvenile pressed against its parent's side, while a human it had no reason to trust bound its wound in the dark. He thought about what it cost to show restraint when everything around you is afraid. Soreth was long behind them now. Somewhere deep in its rock, something large breathed in the dark, alive. "Ask me again," Rael said quietly, "when it matters less." He watched the stars, and the stars did not answer, and that was fine.